Alrighty, so welcome everybody. This is one of Right Hive 2023's panels. We have 5 fabulous panelists here with us today, and we are going to be talking about finding your people through subgenres. So we're going to approach that topic in a number of different ways. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves really quickly. And then we are going to just dive in on this topic. So I'm Alma Raymer. I'm one of the mods this year for Right Hive, and I'm going to have the panelists just introduce themselves really quickly since you've heard their wonderful full intros.
Hi, I'm Esme Symes-Smith. I'm the author of the Sir Callie series. Book 1 is out now, and book 2 is coming out in November. It is a story about a non-binary kid who wants to be a knight and all the good stuff that happens with that. My pronouns are they, them, and yeah, excited to be here.
Good day, everybody. My name is Jesse Pohlman. I'm an author from Long Island, New York, and I wrote Protostar, Memoirs of the Messenger, as well as many other things in the sci-fi fantasy realm. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm really thrilled to be here.
My name is Sara Hashem, and I'm the author of The Jessed Heir, my debut adult fantasy novel that comes out this July about a fugitive queen who strikes a trader's bargain with her worst enemy to secure her freedom. And my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Sean Carroll, pronouns he, him, and I'm an editor with Tomeworks Collective and host of Writer's Lunch. Do a lot of things around Houston, and my last story was published in Decomp Zine out of British Columbia, which was very cool.
Hey everyone, my name is Stephen Indrisano, pronouns he, they. I am something of an odd duck here in that I write primarily for podcasting, specifically horror podcasting. My upcoming project, Shelterwood, a Suburban Gothic, which is something like if Silent Hill met Serial, will be crowdfunding next month in July, and you can find my other work scattered across the internet on shows such as Someone Dies in This Elevator, and other miscellaneous things that I can't speak about yet.
Amazing. Well, thanks to all 5 of you for being here and joining our wonderful audience for finding your people, identifying your subgenre. We are going to go ahead and dive in. First question, I'm going to direct to you, Sean. Let's just start kind of at base level, right? What's the difference between a genre and a subgenre? And why does that difference matter?
Yeah, oh, absolutely, because I was an elementary teacher for a little while. So I'm going to use the example of Stephen because he's right here. So he said that he's doing podcasts and he's doing horror. So one thing you have to think about is what medium you're working in. And then the next thing is how somebody is going to try and sell it. Most of these are determined in terms of mass genres as to how they will be marketed. When you get to subgenre, this is much more determined by the reader, because they can pick and choose and kind of see within a particular genre where things are, as well as cross-genre stuff, to where you're not going for just horror, mystery, literary, which is its own category and style of writing. Don't let them think they're different than the other genres. Science fiction, romance, and they all have their own conventions. Some genres are more hard on the different notes that a story needs to hit, like mystery and romance. Some stories are more loose on the notes you need to hit, like sci-fi and fantasy. Then once you get into subgenres, you can mix and match. So you can have a cozy fantasy like Legends and Lattes that was a big hit last year. You can have things like what am I looking at over here? Kurt Vonnegut, who did write science fiction, absolutely, but is considered literary because of who he's accepted by, or you could say because of how they sold his book.
Awesome. Thank you for that explanation, Sean. And kind of on that note, I'm going to punt this one to both you and Jesse. But how do y'all determine as a writer? I'm not a writer. I'm just a reader, right? So I'm kind of into that subgenre piece. But as a writer, how do y'all determine what subgenre or subgenres, plural, your work fits into. Are there any tools that you use to help you with that process? Obviously, maybe connecting with your readers might be part of that process, right? Since readers are part of that determining process. Are there any subgenres that seemingly cross over from one genre into another genre? How do y'all do this?
Sure. So I think I like to visualize things when I can, and I think there might be 3 useful ways to visualize it. The first is the more conventional hierarchy. We've got the branching trees, all of that. It looks like any old tree that you might find beautiful, hopefully with some nice flowers on it. And one of those flowers might be, say, a hypothetical fantasy novel with many other subgenres underneath that. I supplement this one vision with having more of a web, an interconnectedness, where you've got the fantasy novel connecting with some sci-fi elements having to do with magic and whatever, having to do with maybe some romance because the characters are intertwined. Such things are such things. Third, I think you throw both of those out and you can extrapolate genre identity from your themes. So you've got your reader comes along and sees, oh, well, there's this romance and this magic stuff, but also they're fighting against a corrupt kingdom. And that's got its own sentiment to it. It's got its own feel. And to me, that's my own subgenre.
Love Jesse's explanation there for sure. One way to put it just personally is I write climate fiction, and I started writing it and it was not really a category. So it was very interesting that all of a sudden this started to come out to become a subgenre, because when I might say science fiction, they're thinking spaceships and, way in the future and stuff. And that's a subgenre that is, closer to other things in ways and closer in time than science fiction that is a space opera thousands of years in the future. Another example I would say as well is where you are being published. And so if you as a writer are trying to figure out what you're writing and what subgenre it fits into, this is going to be very important to determine with your beta readers, with your friends, or as you start to feel this out. Because if you are submitting to agents who want a certain thing, you want to hit that. And then therefore, once you get to the next step, you want to be published by someone who is doing what you're doing. In the case of someone like Tor that does science fiction, if you have a romance and you submit it to them, it will not be accepted. So figuring out these genres and these subgenres is very important in your work. And it is very awesome to be an author and be creating. And then with what you make, realize what your subgenre is. I love that compared to calculatingly saying, I'm going to go for this in the web, but also on the fork of the branch, and then throw it all out. And yeah, heck yeah.
If I can jump in as well, I think that really speaks to me as a horror person, because it's one of those broad genres where you can do basically anything in, but when you get down to subgenre, the rules become quite strict. You can't just label something as a slasher because it has the visual appeal of a movie that might have happened in the 80s, right? There are actual story beats and elements that you have to understand for your own work in order to say, yes, I'm writing within this subgenre, because otherwise what you're doing is you're writing to a vibe, and vibes are great. I love vibes, but when we talk about subgenre, we're talking about the lifeblood of the story itself.
I love that. Thank you for adding that, Stephen. And thank you, Jesse and Sean. I love the way that y'all visualize that. As a visual person, I love that visualization and thinking about, right, how that process happens for y'all as writers and or creators in your case, Stephen. So thanks y'all for sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Esme and Sarah now. And I would love for the two of you to explore how subgenres help you connect with the readers that might be into the type of writing that you do, in the case of the two of you. and or your future audience, right? Sarah, you've got your debut novel coming out, I believe this summer. How might this at the same time help a reader, a seasoned reader like myself, connect to new authors and or creators, right? If we're thinking about podcasts and other mediums, that it might be kind of up their alley, right? It might be whether it's cozy sci-fi, right? I know that that's a subgenre I love, or if it's the slasher subgenre within horror. How do you connect with those readers, but then also help the readers connect to you as a new creator?
Personally, I really love the way that Sean especially speaks about subgenre being something that's very like reader-based. And that's definitely something that I identify with. I don't know about y'all, but I never know what I'm writing until after I've written it. And I feel like that must speak to subgenre in such like a way that I've never really thought about before. I know that I love fantasy. I know that I love writing fantasy, but I never know what my subgenre is or what my themes are until afterwards. And, you know, I think about my work and I think about the things that excite me, that I want to like post about online. And, you know, those are the things that come down to subgenre. So for example, I write fantasy, but I specifically write queer fantasy. I write queer fantasy for kids. And it's those very, very specific elements that get readers excited. And I feel like those are the best way to bring in new readers because, you know, readers speak to each other. They're like, oh my goodness, you know, I love cozy fantasies, legends of lattes. Like that's why it blew up, because of it's such the specificity of the subgenre. I call it almost like AO3 tags, like for fan fiction. Readers know what they want. They know the vibes. Let's go back to vibes. So they're going to be searching for the very, very specific things that they're looking for just to like, you know, hit those marks. And I feel like subgenre is such a good way to describe that. So for me as a reader, when I'm looking for new books, I'm really looking at the people who, you know, like the similar things that I like the vibes, like the themes. So I will trust their opinion on the next book that I'm going to pick up. Yeah, no, I've always struggled with subgenre, and I think especially as like a queering writer or a writer going on sub, especially a new one who doesn't really understand necessarily like what subgenre means. I remember when I was first querying my very first book, and I think I must have had a list of 10 subgenres because you want to really specify like what your book is, and it was all completely wrong. And I feel like a really strong, grabby book can be boiled down to like 1 or 2 subgenres very easily. And if you're struggling to categorize your work, then it might mean that you're struggling to, you know, finish your book. Because for me, it was definitely a sign that I was ignoring, that it wasn't really ready to go out into the world. But when I wrote my debut, I knew exactly what it was. I knew the genre, I knew the subgenre, and I knew my audience. And I also knew how to connect with the readers who would enjoy that. I feel like if you're on social media as an author, that's the best way to find your readers, is just like post the things that you enjoy as a reader, the things that speak to you as the author of this work. And then folks will come and folks will spread it. And it's like wildfire and it's fabulous.
I echo most of that, especially with fantasy. I think it gets particularly tricky because subgenres can be entirely in the eye of the beholder. When I was querying, I put fantasy, I think, with romance elements, or I might not have even put that at all. I changed the query letter a couple of times, but it was a fantasy novel. Since then, it's been described generally by the publisher as a political fantasy. Cool. Did I envision that when I was writing it? No, it just wrote it that way. Fantasy romance, that one is another one that goes around a lot, and you can see when it's where it's categorized on retailer sites and how different bloggers and reviewers categorize it. Some firmly think it's for fantasy romance. Some say actually it plays a very small part in the book. I think this is entirely a fantasy novel. And so trying to hammer down exactly what your specified subgenres are is almost impossible and unnecessarily limiting. I think because at the end of the day, if the reader is picking it up and resonating with something very specific in the book that you don't think is enough to be its own subgenre, if it's the way some I've seen some queries are putting elements of, right, or they're putting with the notes, almost like they're describing a recipe with like an ingredient list, and so they're putting down each, you know, couple notes of this here, a couple tablespoons of this. If you aren't thinking about that because it's playing a much more minor role in your mind, that's fine. You can talk about it. And especially if you think that this is going to draw in a readership that maybe on its own wouldn't be interested in, say, a political fantasy, but they like fantasy romance, so they might be interested in a political fantasy with romance in it. And I've noticed that, especially in terms of marketing the books, it's a lot easier to maybe pick 2 or 3 subgenres, really, and hone in on them. I talk a lot about the fact that the Jet Set Air is Egyptian inspired. That was something when I was querying I did not mention. That was something that came in after the fact, way later. And now I talk about it a lot because I think people don't see it often. I think it gets people excited who maybe don't even really look for non-Western fantasy by themselves, but if it's there, they realize, oh, okay, there's non-Western fantasy out there. I'm expanding my reading goals and I want to include this in my reading list. People who are interested in certain types of romance tropes. My book is enemies to lovers. I talk about it a lot. So people who like that trope, they get to hear about it a lot. And so different readers who are looking for different things in the books that they're picking up or that they might be interested in are going to construe what's in the book differently. And I just try to talk about my favorite parts of it, the parts that I'm noticing are resonating with different readers, and hope that it just reaches the audience that would be interested in it.
I really love what you're saying about subgenres kind of being in the eye of the beholder. And I feel like so much of writing, especially fiction, is so subjective in a kind of ridiculous kind of way. Like we can have our interpretation of our books, but as soon as they're in somebody else's hands, it could be something else entirely. I personally find that really, really exciting. And I also think it's easy to mismarket your books if you're focused too heavily on subgenre. I've noticed this especially with publishers calling something a rom-com when it's not, or those romantic aspects. I try not to worry about that too much personally, but I've definitely seen a lot of like frustration, maybe especially in the YA space, where something is mismarketed in a particular subgenre when it might not be that. And I feel like, I don't know if you guys pay much attention to your Amazon books, but the way that Amazon chooses its subgenre categories is just completely wild to me. I think I've been pretty lucky with mine, but I know friends whose books have just been, I don't know, it's like they got the concept of a book and they threw it on there, and these are the subgenres that are in completely different genre range than what they're actually writing. So yeah, I love that it's subjective, but I know it can also be frustrating.
That's super fun. And this whole nother level of subgenre is the Amazon ones, because you can get the analytics and you can see who is the number 3 book in, I don't know, werewolf romance, enemies to lovers, under 250 pages, like this is insane. And Sarah, I love what you were saying about it being a recipe. And some of the best recipes are just short and simple. It's 3 ingredients, 5 ingredients. You are not labeling out, like 500 different things.
Oh, if we're talking about crazy categorization, have you all seen Goodreads? Before I ban myself off the website, the shelves that people will put your book on are truly mind-boggling. So that was an experience.
Listen, if it gets us to number 1 somewhere, we can put it on our Twitter profile. We'll take it.
Touche.
Touche, indeed. I love that. Now I feel like I want to go look up all y'all's works and see what shelves they're on Goodreads. Awesome. So this next one, I'm gonna punt the idea, at least, to Esme and Jesse. For y'all, and you write pretty different things in terms of genres, at least, right? And the way that your works might be categorized in subgenres. How do the subgenres that you write within help you to identify themes in your work? And how does that help you potentially lead a reader through a conversation with you as the writer?
Okay, so I'm going through the notes that I have written down about this panel we're doing, and I see a lot of stuff saying, Sean said about how the reader determines it. Esme says, they don't know it until it's written. Stephen talks about the vibes, and that just made me think of the Terminator, by the way, because I'm just finished a rewatch of some of those movies. Sarah talks about how it's in the eye of the beholder. And it's labeled a political fantasy by the publisher, and in the end, there's a recipe to it. And I think that's where it gets interesting, because in a lot of ways, the theme pulls out the Uno reverse card and tells you that, actually, no, I'm going to identify what shelf your book belongs on because I'm this theme in here that's hiding out. So like the Terminator, one of the themes is predestination, and there is no fate but what we make. And how, in a lot of ways, that makes it like this heady, complicated thing about how time travel works. And then you get on a more basic character-centered level, and you've got, what are these characters going through? What are they facing in terms of antagonists, in terms of conflict with one another? Another example might be thinking about that. Hi, Kat. Thinking about that fantasy novel that I'm cooking up in my head. Let's pretend. The protagonist and his friend, but maybe not yet lover, they discover they've been pawns in someone else's political games. Those exploitations and betrayals are virtually identical to the kinds of power plays we see in modern politics, just maybe with a little less literal backstabbing. So your theme is going to help figure out which of those Amazon categories your book ends up in. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because it's in that category on Amazon with your analytics and you're crying at your low KENPs, at least I am, that you're going to, I think I lost my train of thought, but I think you get what I mean.
I feel that deeply in my soul. I'll start rambling and I'll be like, I don't think I answered your question, but here are my words. But that's why we're novelists, right? I also have forgotten the question. Can we have that repetition of that?
Absolutely. So, and Esme, I know this is something that you're really passionate about, but, and we talked about this, but how do subgenres help you to identify the themes in your work? And how does that help you engage with your readers or your audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talking about subgenres and the specificities in there, when I realized what my subgenre was, and themes come out along with the subgenre. So my themes are, for example, like post-traumatic stress and childhood abuse and friendship and found family and all those things that are like encompassed within subgenre within the genre itself. And it's really, I think it comes down to the humanity of the work, for me at least. My themes are always very, very character-based. I'm always writing because I can't find what I need as a reader in the world. And maybe that's because I'm not looking hard enough, but that's a whole nother thing. So when I'm writing, I'm specifically speaking to those readers. There's a cat butt right there. Amazing. I'm specifically speaking to the readers who, like me, are looking for these characters and these themes to come out in a certain way, who maybe, they can see themselves in the contemporary fiction space, but not necessarily in the speculative. And I think that's what I love most about speculative, is that there's so much scope for different subgenres and different themes. As far as my work goes, I always call Sir Callie my 2020 political book that's set in a medieval middle grade fantasy world, because wow, do I feel that. But I wouldn't necessarily call it a political fantasy, even though it has those themes. So I feel like, the subgenre is the overarching reason why people will pick up the books, but then the themes are the little things that, speak so strongly to the reader that will keep them reading and really like connect to the book, the work, the story, in a unique way. So you can read like 10 middle grade fantasy books, and each one will come out with something different because of the themes and because of the subgenre. Yeah, and I think it's all about specificity and like the heart and soul of your story.
Beautiful. Thank you both. Stephen, I'm going to pass this next one to you. I know you've been a little quiet. So I want to talk about
No one's ever told that to me in my life. This is a big day for me.
There we go. There we go. We've got your mood lighting going on. Let's talk about non-written forms of these same genres and subgenres. How does that shift the conversation that we're having when media is transversing and subsecting these different delivery methods?
So complicated.
Yeah,
so beautiful
yeah.
and strange. So as a podcaster, you know, I no matter what project I'm working on, I have to do a lot of work to have the media be taken in by people, because podcasting as a form is relatively new compared to, say, the novel. You know, you have to do some education, and there's this tightrope walk that you have to do between representing your work in a way that is understandable on social media, in particular, your Pinterests, your Tumblrs, your immediate visual shorthands, while not cheapening the work. And I think that's something that is so difficult to do right now, because discoverability for everyone is at an all-time high, which means that there's a lot of elbowing that one has to do. We're no longer beholden to the same gatekeepers. So I think that when you talk about all media that has been advertised at this point has become transverse, has kind of started to transcend just the thing itself, and is endlessly analyzed once it's out, and also is endlessly connected to visual, especially visual, things within a similar subgenre paradigm. So for example, I'm working on a suburban gothic. I'm doing a lot of work on social media, retweeting pictures of spooky broken down houses and abandoned malls, you know, boosting mockumentary people in this space because I love their work and it's related to mine. But it is so essential as a writer that you don't boil your work down to that your work is not social media. Your work is to write a story. And if you can allude to what's cool about your story in social media, that's great. And you can allude to subgenre on social media, and that's also great. But the actual work of being within a subgenre is not just aesthetic in the kind of new social media way that we talk about it. It's actually aesthetic in the much older academic sense of the term, and that it's a specific set of values and meanings that need to be in the writing itself. Does that answer your question?
I just want to say that I love that so much, because especially as someone who lives most of their life on Twitter, which is not a healthy thing to do.
No.
I feel like, yes, subgenre as a category has like boiled down to the aesthetic, and it's almost like the tables in the high school dining room.
Yes.
It's just like, I want to go sit with these guys. It's the high fantasy folks, or I want to go sit with these guys. It's the political science fiction folks. But like, it's not just about sitting down and eating your fries. It's about putting the work in. It's about what means the most to you as a writer, and why you're telling the stories, and why you want to write, and why it's important to you to get that work out there, whether you're doing podcast or fiction or nonfiction or anything. It's not just about, putting on the beret and going, I'm an XT writer. It's about sitting your ass down on the chair every day and crying over your keyboard, the same way, whatever subgenre you're writing. And I think that's really, really important to really emphasize, especially for new writers, for unpublished writers, for writers who, can see what they want to achieve, but they haven't quite got there yet. And I feel like especially now, it's really hard to say, actually, the thing that matters most is the work and the words. and not making pretty aesthetics on Canva, even though that's fun and you can call it useful procrastination.
Do love Canva.
I love
I
Canva.
do. It is good though.
But I will also say that I really struggle with visual things. So for me, making my aesthetics and my character art, that has been very helpful for me and very productive for me. So there is something to be said for it.
Definitely. Yeah. I think it all comes back to what's it in service of. If you're writing your work in service to either an algorithm or a sorting system, it's going to lose something. If you are recognizing powerful things in your work through the lens of subgenre, for example, it can give you clarity on what it is that you're interested in. I did not think of myself as a Gothic writer until I started writing this piece. And then there's a certain way that things curdle in the Gothic. Everything has to go wrong in all horror, but it goes wrong in specific ways in specific subgenres. And it was only when I started to notice that there were repeated patterns of the way things would go south where I was like, oh, I'm a Gothic writer. So you'll actually find it, I think, less so in social media and more so in the actual depths of your soul. So if you can reach down there.
I got to throw it out there since Twitter came up, and I think it was just a little bit ago, Biggest Dickless or something like that. The guy who wrote a tweet that went absolutely viral. I think he just loves Trigun, which is an anime about a space cowboy, and it's got nothing at all to do with how to win the Time War, which is a literary, very difficult to read. What I forget the word for, like, it's difficult, like, and he got it on the bestseller list like 3 years after it had been released. And it's just where like lightning hits between different genres, or you wouldn't think that a certain type of reader would be interested in your subgenre. There are some weird threads out there that will hit in strange ways.
It's almost like a particle reaction, like a nuclear explosion, just these two like really powerful, really random things just like suddenly colliding, going boom. And I'm so here for the chaos. I love it. As long as like publishers don't try and replicate it in some kind of weird way, like I think I love it.
Someone even, and I think this is real, was going to make a sticker, like,
Yes,
like the
Waterstone,
As Seen on Book
Waterstone.
Talk sticker, and they're going to put like a Biggest Dickless sticker on all the books in Barnes and Noble, and then they're looking for the next one. And I'm like, you can't grab that. You can't put that in a bottle, man.
I just really enjoy imagining that person just being like, I don't know what I did, but I guess I did. They're literally the most powerful person in the industry right now.
From posting Trigun, my shipping fan art.
Y'all are cracking me up. One kind of through line that I'm hearing y'all talk about in terms of social media and aesthetics, but also Stephen, kind of hearkening back to the history of different genres that you mentioned, right? My knowledge is limited here in terms of like audio for horror, right? And with the advent of podcasts, that's becoming more and more common. But if we hearken way back, right, we can think about radio and those kinds of things for the medium or a medium for sharing horror stories. And so I don't know that I have a well-formed question, but I'm thinking about kind of this tension between the history with some of these subgenres and genres, and the historical moment in which we live, right, where social media and social media aesthetics are so important to writers, they're important to readers, they're important to people who talk about the written word or even write horror as a listener. And so I'm wondering if, and maybe I'll start with Stephen, but maybe this is a question for everybody since we're all kind of talking about social media, is kind of talking about that tension, thinking about that tension, right, between the history of some of these genres and subgenres. And for those of you who are writers, right, that history is a little bit different than it is for Stephen, with sort of this modern tension of like the aesthetic of the horror writer, or of the writer in Esme's case, right, who writes middle grade queer fantasy books, right? Talk to me about that tension for y'all as creators.
I think it's perhaps more of an illusion than we choose to think about. I think when we think about art that we love from the past, we want to think about it as a pure expression of the artist. But if you think about the history of, coming from an auditory perspective, right? If you think about the history of music, the way that even very basic music was and is made is very reliant on the medium of what speaker is being put out, right? The Beatles would not be making the Beatles music today because today we have streaming. Today you're listening primarily in cars. You're not trying to sell necessarily tickets to go see these bands live in Liverpool. You're looking to get them onto a popular playlist somewhere where it's going to get played 20 times. And that's true also across the arts. So I think when you talk about I think part of this question was, what kind of person should you be to embody your art well in this very specific market that we live in? And unfortunately, I think the answer to that is that there isn't one way to do it. There's been some amazing work in horror specifically around online guerrilla marketing that actually adds to the potency of what's scary. So an early example of this would be Marble Hornets. This is where Slender Man comes from, right? At the same time that these videos were being released on YouTube on a really not well, put together YouTube channel, they were also tweeting live. They were doing things like dropping other videos on other channels. And we look back, we think of that as one coherent piece of media made by one coherent kind of person. But in reality, it's always kind of a messy process of taking what works and taking what doesn't work and weighing what you can do with them, if that makes sense.
I really love that. And I think it speaks a lot to Kidlit in general. Like the books that I love the most, they're the ones that I read when I was 10, 12, 13. And they're the books that I look back on now and I feel a little bit uncomfortable about it. You know what we're talking about. So as a Kidlit writer, especially of fantasy, I'm looking at the parts that made me fall in love with these stories, with these worlds. And I'm also looking at the places where I was frustrated as a kid and I'm frustrated as a grown-up, especially in regards to the characters that get to shine, the characters that are given the space to grow. Something that has always been really, really important to me is that, the concept of hero and how anyone can be a hero, whether you're a good person, you're a messy person, you're a person who, starts off struggling and ends up not struggling, or even if you're struggling at the end, all through Kidlit fiction, I've been frustrated that, there's always a certain kind of archetype of the hero. It's the shiny golden kid. Whereas, that's just not realistic. And as a child who was not shiny and not golden, I always felt very, unseen in children's literature. So when it came to writing, when it came to working out who I wanted to be as an author, I was really going back to, the classic things that I love, like the knights and the horses and the adventures, the really timeless things, but I wanted to bring it into the modern era. So kids now, every kid can see themselves, every kid can, identify themselves on the page. So I really like the idea of the balance between, taking what exists and being thankful for the authors who came before, who paved the way for us, but also carrying on the tradition and making it better, not necessarily overwriting something, but just continuing the conversation. I've had a lot of people liken Callie to, Tamora Pierce and the Alana books. And, that's something that I've thought about a lot because, those are the books that I grew up with. I love them with my whole heart and soul. But when it came to writing, I wanted to write something that made me feel that way, that would help someone else feel that way, but not necessarily overwriting, not saying oh, mine's better, it's just different. It's a continuation. And my work would not exist without the work that came before. So I feel like being respectful and paying homage to, you know, the subgenres and the authors in those subgenres is such a valuable thing to do while still doing something new and doing something special. I feel like if you go too far and, you know, you're writing the things that, you know, very classic, made you love it, but you're not doing anything new, you're not thinking about it critically, you're thinking about it, you know, if you love like 80s space opera, you're still writing for the 80s space opera person in the 80s, whereas like we're in 2023, it's going to be something different, it's going to be something new. You know, you have a whole new generation of reader. And I think it's really important in your subgenre to really work out who your reader is now and not necessarily who your reader was when you fell in love with that subgenre yourself.
Let me throw it for a second, just real quick too, because I love that point, Esme, about taking things and switching them and trading them, which is to go back to mythology and folk tales. And a lot of times in folk tales, we look at them as, you know, like Grimm's fairy tales, whatever, they're written down in a certain way, and that's how they stay. And the original way of being told the same story again and again and again was for each teller to reverse some part of it. It is a tragedy. Next time you tell it, it's a triumph. It depends on the audience, who you're telling it to. It depends on you trying to one-up the last person who wrote something and beat their ass. And we all know who we're talking about in terms of YA fantasy authors. And that is a push that we should not discount, even though we're talking about the written word and putting it out there in this different way. That's the root of telling stories, is reversing, one-upping, changing what was previous.
To come full circle to the idea of radio versus podcasting versus whatever, I think that podcasting gives us a really useful example of just how deep that iteration process goes, because we tend to think of the written word as static, whereas other forms of things are not static, right? Oh, podcasting is new, but ultimately it's a similar language to where we were in radio, and it's a similar language to where radio left off when it moved more towards nonfiction over time. So you can see that lineage, and you can see the reinvention very clearly in podcasting. But I want to also encourage anyone who's writing, even if you're writing novels, right, something that's a very established form, to consider that you are in fact bringing something new to the form every time you sit down to write. How long are your chapters? How are your sentences put together? Are you mixing different points of view? These are things that are genuinely novel and actually get to the heart of the medium itself, not just your story or subgenre.
Awesome. I love this conversation. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love the idea that Stephen mentioned that today we have streaming, and how, Esme, Sean, you talked about, a lot of it depends on the audience and what makes you fall in love. And I think tie it sort of back to the social media aspects of it. We have sort of democratized what themes exist in work. We have sort of democratized what genres exist in work. And to tie back to that thing Sarah said earlier about how her publisher put a kind of label on the genre, I think that's pretty key, because now that we all have this wonderful service that, if you're joining us live, we're on the Discord right now, you can ask us questions. That's something that didn't exist even when I was a little kid. I grew up with the internet, and maybe that poisoned my mind a little, I don't know. But the point of the matter is, it enabled me to get a whole list of different people's things that they loved, so that I could bring it in and make something of my own with it.
I love that. And I think that's a really great segue for a question I would actually like to punt your way, Sarah, which is, you talked a little bit earlier about genre overlap and the way that your work has been categorized, maybe miscategorized even sometimes, right? Compared to your intentions as a writer. How does genre overlap and maybe subgenre overlap within genres make your own work more messy, but also maybe more helpful, more fun, maybe more confusing for publishers, but also more marketable at the same time? Tell me about that.
Well, fortunately, I wouldn't say that any of the categorizations I've seen have been incorrect, unless they call it YA since it's adult, but that's a whole other thing. My publisher, once they said political fantasy, I hadn't actually heard of the term before. I wasn't really active on most of the writer spaces until around 2020. And then I started following along and learning a lot of these new terms for the first time. So when they used that phrase, political fantasy, I looked up different titles that were political fantasy. I read a good number of them and I thought, oh, they were right. That's what my book is. And I mean, it makes drafting. So for book 2 right now, the sequel to the Just Said Heir, now that I'm more aware of political fantasy, fantasy romance, all of these little subgenres and categories and people's thoughts about which they wanted to see more of, what they would like expanded on, it definitely makes it more messy, which is part of the reason I try to not look anymore about what people are categorizing the book as. I am trying not to look at the general readership's ideas of the subgenres. I focus in on what do me and my publisher agree. These are the subgenres for the book. And fortunately, most of them are the ones that the audience as a whole resonates with. But for drafting, it definitely does make it very confusing, but I don't mind that. My strategy that I'm trying to give myself grace with drafting after delivering, you've been looking at a clean, proofread book a gazillion times, and now you are staring at your screen that has what you think is the world's worst writing looking back at you and trying to make peace with, okay, I will have to rewrite most of this. A lot of my ideas are going to be scrapped. Entire chapters will be rewritten because I heavily revise. And I try to give myself the grace to know that that's okay. What I'm doing now is learning more about the world. I'm learning more about what the characters are doing right now, what they want. And so when I come back and I sharpen this, I can actually put what my hopes are for, I do want to expand on this subgenre here, and this is the best way to do it. I want to talk more about this element of the book that was present in the Just Said Heir, but maybe not so present that I would call it a subgenre. And now I can really flesh it out in this particular way. And so it has its pros and cons, as long as I think you're not trying to fit a book that you're still working on, that is still in its very early phases, into these categories. It's better to just let yourself write. And then after the fact, maybe give it a couple of names, and with the full awareness that it's out of your control. I could hand it to my editor and she could have an entirely different thought on what this is than if I handed it to my agent, than if I handed it to a reader. And so I just have to know what I want to write and then let it be reflected back however it will be.
I'm just going to say awesome on that, reflected back at the author.
Yeah, I'm in drafting hell on my 3rd book right now, and it's not as bad as book 2 was, but I've definitely recognized the patterns in myself where I'm staring at my document and going, oh God, I hate this. Like, that it's just like, okay, I have the physical evidence that it's possible, and it's going to be okay, and right with the door shut, and all of those things that I'm just telling myself over and over. I feel like it never gets easier. That, we prove to ourselves again and again that it's possible.
I love that. And I feel like that's a great segue, unless anybody else has a comment on that question. Beautiful. Okay. So I'm hearing, Sarah, thank you for kind of creating this beautiful segue for me, but I want to, again, right, as a reader, as a non-creator or creative within the space that the 6 of us are in, I wonder how y'all take care of yourselves, right, through the writing process or the creative and creation process, whether that's, right, what Sarah was pointing to of just making peace with, right, I'm going to write what I'm going to write, and we'll figure out what those genres and subgenres are later, and not letting yourself get pigeonholed. Or, right, Esme talking about just crying over your keyboard and hammering it out sometimes, right? And I wonder if there are ways that writing within the subgenres that you find yourselves in actually helps you engage in self-care as writers and as creatives.
I mean, as the resident horror nerd here, I feel it's probably my patriotic duty to take this one. I mean, the Gothic especially is all about not shying away from the things that are troubling, whether it's due to the personal weight that they hold on you, troubling due to social mores, due to what they say about our society, what have you. And I've definitely found that allowing myself to engage with those things as a writer in this kind of play space is good for me overall as a person. It allows me to understand my own reactions to the world. And, you know, in podcasting especially, you're doing script play, you know, you're writing characters who are speaking to each other all the time. That's where a lot of the power is. And any writer can attest to this, that when you have two characters speaking to each other, they're two tiny parts of your soul that you're just like bumping together like you're in second grade and they're dolls. So I think when you talk about subgenre and self-care, especially if you're in horror, you have to think about both the fact that it allows you to enter those spaces, and you have to think about how to exit those spaces when you're ready. So for me, it's making sure that I never write that close to bed, not necessarily because I've freaked myself out, but just because I need some runway, right? I need to watch some reality television and eat some ice cream on some nights. But I'd recommend anyone who's feeling like they want to try their hand at a genre they haven't done before, because they're feeling things internally and they want to work them out, just try it, right? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? You're going to not be good at things you try for the first time until you hammer them into shape, and then they'll be delightful. And hopefully, if you're in horror, they'll scare some people too, which is great fun, let me say.
I want to speak a little bit about like writing books about queer kids, especially books about like trans kids right now. Because when I first wrote book one, I intended it to be very like, you know, looking back on these terrible things that we've gone through from 2016. And then it turned into, oh, this is current. And this is very, very real, and it's very, very scary. And honestly, I feel like it's only got worse. So as I'm writing, I'm very, very aware that what I'm writing is what folks are going through right now. Even though I'm writing, you know, fantasy, medieval fantasy, it's, you know, gray adults being called terrible things because, you know, they are trans or they are queer, and they're being called dangerous to their kids who they love, whereas like the people who are actually dangerous to these children are, you know, being lauded as something great. And it's been really, really tough for me to kind of, you know, find that balance between, you know, what I'm writing about and my writing, because at the end of the day, I am writing for kids. I'm writing something that I want to be hopeful, something that I do want to be an escape, but I find myself being like dragged down into like, just like really heavy feelings of just hopelessness that I don't know how to pull myself out of. And like, it was really interesting. A few months ago, I was drafting, and, you know, I was in my feelings, and I had a virtual school visit that day with an amazing group of queer kids in, gosh, I don't remember where, Tennessee, I think. And just talking to them and hearing their excitement and their passion and their determination to like fight against, you know, the politicians that are trying to like ruin people's lives right now. Like, it was so inspiring, and it just like, it pulled me out of my funk and was just like, yes, these are the kids who are in my book. These are the kids who I want to write for and write about. It's the kids who are not hopeless. They're the kids who see the light at the end of all of this, even if I can't right now. So yeah, it's been really weird and really hard to just kind of like pull myself out of there and come at it from a different perspective, like a truly different perspective that's not my own, because as someone with a pretty decent imagination, I can imagine what anyone thinks, but this is something I've especially struggled with, is seeing like, how can we fix this problem? And these kids saying that, like, even if it's not okay right now, then we're going to fight until it is, period. So yeah, it's definitely tough. And I think what Stephen said about like taking time away from it just to kind of like decompress is such an important thing to do, because like whether you're writing horror or you're writing, contemporary about real issues, stepping away from all the drama that's in your head, I think is such a valuable thing. And just like literally touch some lovely soft grass, go drink a cup of tea, go watch some Schitt's Creek. Just really be aware of your emotions and your feelings. I think especially if you're a character-driven author, it can get very, very hard to pull yourself out of that space. I've definitely found all through like my writing life that if I'm writing a project, I will end up really feeling like my main character, even when I'm not tapping away at my keyboard. And that can be not great. So I feel like really just compartmentalizing your workspace and your work time and saying, okay, this is when I'm going to engage with these tough things, and this is when I'm going to disengage. And I will say that like having a day job where I shut my laptop and I go and cuddle some very small children it's fabulous, because, this is real life. I love fiction. Fiction is so, so important. But at the end of the day, it's real life, and it's your like real physical body and it's your real physical health that matters the most. And if you're suffering, then, your work's going to suffer too.
Well, I mean, as far as self-care goes, I don't know about self-care, but I've got my cat trying to give me some care right now. So I'm thinking back to what Esme was talking about when it comes to queer characters, and pretty much all of my fiction has some queer dimensionality to it. But aside from some of my first books, I haven't made that too much of a point of conflict for myself, just because it is close to home. I try to keep, and this is weird because I went to college and I read all this dystopian literature, 1984, Brave New World, Handmaid's Tale, Canticle for Leibowitz, the list goes on. And yet when I write stuff, it tends to be more upbeat, more fantastical, more the hero wins the day and does good most of the time. And yes, some bad things happen, but the characters are able to endure whatever those bad things are, because in the end, I, as the author, have to be able to endure the bad things that happen to me. And that includes when my lovely little kitten decides to nibble on me. But that's, like I said, another story.
I think they're depending on the levels or layers of self-care. If we're talking about self-care in terms of being able to sit down in front of your laptop and work in a way that doesn't make you angry at your own manuscript, I don't do this in drafting, but I've heard that it works. And so I am trying it this time around, which is skipping to scenes that you're really excited to write, skipping to parts of the story that you're really excited to see unfold, and working on those so that it doesn't feel like you're just stuck in this particular place and you can't move through it. And that feeling stuck will definitely affect how you're just getting through the manuscript, because then you're going to have a section that's rushed. You're just trying to get through it, and you can fix it during revisions. But I feel like if there's ways for you to be excited about the book the entire time you're going through it, doing whatever you need to do to keep that feeling alive is just the best strategy. And so I'm trying it this time around, and it's more or less working. The Word document is open and it's no longer taunting me. As for self-care in general, a lot of the authors I spoke to about debut year said very kindly that it was going to suck. And they prefaced that with, it'll feel a lot better once it's over. Like once the book is actually out there, all of the things that you worry about and obsess over will be out of mind, more or less. And so I've tried to keep that perspective that yes, it's normal to feel like this when it's coming out. I mean, you have a book that people are perceiving. You have a work that you put a lot of energy and tears and time into. And now that is something that others will consume, and the way they consume it has nothing to do with you. And so being able to kind of connect with readers, but in a way build a wall, cut myself off from, I guess, almost a parasocial relationship where I think whatever their thoughts are have anything to do with me, has been helpful. Getting off of Twitter for a good chunk of time was really helpful. I'm still barely on there now. I pop in, pop out, see what's going on, and sometimes I just ask friends for updates. And then with other social media platforms, it depends. The ones that make me happier are the ones that I stick around on more. And I think the other part of that, which, wow, that just flew out of my brain. Oh yes, the day job. I'm at a phase right now. I just actually graduated last weekend from grad school. Thank you. And so I'm preparing for the bar I'll be taking it a week after the book comes out. 1 week. And so if I don't, so that's why it's really important to identify what is stressing me out that I have to let stress me out, and what am I manufacturing for myself. And so the parts that I'm manufacturing largely come from things I can't control with the book. And so it's easier said than done, but trying to just have controlled stress, the things that no matter what you do, they are going to be a source of anxiety for you. Let them be and just ride that out, but don't heap on top of it with things that are unnecessary stressors if you can help it.
So my anxiety spiked just hearing that. So I can't even, oh Lord.
Well, it's been an interesting couple of months trying to manage how to relax and all of that. Sleep is apparently very important.
Allegedly. I was thinking about my lead up to debut. My book came out in November, so I had a whole debut year to have fun. And it was so weird because I got to September or October, and it was like, everything's done. I don't have anything to do. The books, I can't do anything. And my mental health was at its lowest. It just manifested so physically. I remember waking up every night at 3 a.m. and not being able to go back to sleep and just lying on the couch in the dark going, it was horrible. And it hurt, my chest hurt a good 2 months. So I can't even imagine what it's like when you have other things going on as well as your debut coming out. Even if everything's going perfectly, wonderfully fabulous, it's still really, really stressful. And honestly, I feel just allowing yourself to feel that way, even though it's sucky, is very valuable, because I don't know, I feel I fought it so hard, but there was nothing I could do about it. I have my medication, but apart from that, there's nothing I could do about it. It's just a matter of bearing it and going this is why. It's not about anything else that I can do something about. It's about stuff that is completely out of my control, and just kind of bearing it until it's over. And I will say, just be kind to yourself the month after debut, because I think that's when you crash, because I feel you've been wound so tight for such a long time, the thread finally snaps, and that's okay. Just lie on the couch, it's going to be okay. So yeah, I feel checking in with yourself constantly, even just getting a couple of months of therapy, if you don't do therapy, is really valuable, just to talk it out, even if especially honestly, if it's someone that doesn't understand publishing. It can be very validating to talk to someone who doesn't know what you're talking about and hear them go that's normal. Because publishing is such a bad, crazy industry. I remember I started therapy because I was just feeling so weird, and so I was feeling nothing. I think it was January, so it was 2 months after my debut came out, and good things were happening, and I wouldn't feel anything. And because I'm in Aries, I feel everything very, very strongly all the time, whether it's good or bad. And I was just nothing, and that was what was freaking me out the most. So therapy really helped with that. And just letting yourself feel weird, because wow, it's bizarre, because you've been leading up to this moment probably your entire life, and it's the biggest moment. And then suddenly it's here, and you're an author, and holy moly, it's wild. It gets better.
And you got the bar exam to boot. I wish you luck with that. That's a lot.
Thank you. Weirdly enough, having that to stress about has made it easier to not stress about the book, because if I stress about the book, what am I going to do? I'm going to get up and stress and do pointless things. But if I stress about the bar, I'm going to get up and study. So
I was going to say, I definitely recommend taking the bar if you're looking to kind of unwind from your.
I was going to say, I'm not convinced by any of you to become a creator at this point.
Oh my gosh, it's really funny. Like whenever I talk to kids about being an author, I end up on these tangents where it's just like everything sucks. You don't get paid. You hate getting off the couch to do your words, but it's fabulous. But honestly, I say if you have to do it, and if you don't have to do it, please don't.
Well, let me throw this out there to cherry pick different things people said, and also to bring it to subgenre as well, because there are things out there where the people who love horror probably very similar to the people who love death metal, and in that respect, they are some of the nicest, kindest people out there. So it's like, you can think of this as, you are cross-pollinating between different things. You are enjoying different media, enjoying different things, and that is where you can find your tribe. So you happen to be a fantasy author who also crochets and enjoys hang gliding. Great. There definitely is a subgenre of life that will hit that, and there is a group of people who out there who, will hit that. So that's awesome. Now, in terms of writing something, putting it out there, and feeling worried about this, I go back to when I was an art critic, and I was very worried about that and putting things out there and who's going to read it. And then I just thought, there are 15 people, and I am writing this for 15 people. I don't know who they are, but they will enjoy it, and I'm not going to worry about anything over 15. So it's like you put it out there and you are just doing this, and maybe one hits and another one does not. And an article, causes a controversy, and an article totally dies. It doesn't matter. 15 people read it. That's all I was expecting. And so being right-sized in terms of that and putting things out there, and the anxiety before you get anything published and the anxiety once you get something published are very related.
Amazing. Thank you for tying it back to subgenre, Sean. I love it. I love it. This whole conversation has been really fabulous. And I really have enjoyed as a reader, as a consumer of the media that y'all create. For those of us who get to enjoy consuming it, it's been really lovely hearing how things are for you on the creative side and on the creator side. So I just want to thank each of you for joining us, for finding your people, identifying your subgenre. I feel like I need to go enjoy some of my favorite subgenres now over the next couple of days. Thanks again to Esme, Jesse, Sarah, Sean, and Stephen for being such wonderful panelists. For those who are watching, keep those questions coming for the panelists for the Q&A portion. And thanks also to Right Hive for hosting. Thanks, y'all.